And so he agreed. And then from there, I had been hearing and seeing this story about Carol Jenkins for a couple years since I was there. And her father every September would get on the TV and just say, I need help. And so I just felt like, what has been done in this case? It's 30 something years old and nobody's doing anything. And so I called him up and said, has this story ever been a part of a investigative effort by the news media? And he said no. And so to me, that meant there was prime opportunity to get into this case and to dig a little bit and see what I could find. I couldn't guarantee him anything or my station for that fact. So as in with investigations, you have to have some that that are going to work because your station's going to want you to produce. But at the same time, I pitched this story and I said, I want to do this. And then the caveat was, well, you can only do it if you find something that's new or relevant or different and that will move the case forward. And so that's what I started to do. So I actually asked to do this story. And then when I started learning about the suspects and the fact that they said they had three suspects and the main person was dead from a shootout, I thought, okay, well, let's find out more about him. But we couldn't find out anything because it didn't happen. So that's kind of how the story started. So there's a reason why, as journalists, we have to have more than one source or a way to be able to back up what someone is saying. And it's there for everybody's protection. It's there so that we don't get pulled into stories and spread misinformation. It protects us in that way, but it also protects the public that we're not giving them something that isn't true, that's hard to pull back. And we're protecting the people that are coming to us in a sense. Of course, they want us to report the stories sometimes, but we have to say, you know what? It's going to be a better story if we can find that other person or somebody else that can corroborate this, or if we can find documents that support what you're saying. And so it was very important. And so what I realized that needed to happen is that for Shirley to speak to me, she had to be able to trust me. And so if I went ahead and put something on the air, that would end everything because she wasn't ready for that yet. But it was like she was doing this, she was kind of like unburdening to me in a way through these voicemails. So while I knew I couldn't put them on the air right then, I learned very quickly that I better save them because she was, sharing things that were pretty important. And the biggest lesson I learned was the first call when she said, if the girl had a yellow scarf and was killed with a screwdriver, my father could be the killer. I kept that voicemail, but we got a new phone system. And when the phone systems transferred over, any voicemail that was over 2 weeks old got erased. I
Mhm.
was devastated. Now, the good thing was I had written it down and I had shared it with my boss and I had shared it with my producer. So, and I had played it for other people. So they knew that it existed. They knew that it was true. But I lost that voicemail and I was just like, oh my gosh, I can't do that. I can't lose that. And there was no way to get it back in this new phone system. So from that point on, that's when I knew that, after the end of the week, my photographer and I would sit there and we would play the voicemails and record them and keep them on tape. But I think also just back during that time, technology wasn't what it is today. And so I remember going to the Marion County Library for days and sitting in the microfilm room and going through newspapers on microfilm that were dark and grainy. You could hardly read. I was trying to find out more information about Shirley, about her dad, about who she might have been married to. And unfortunately, I had found her in-laws. So I had found them, which was a great thing. But she was married for such a short amount of time that this family, and then all these years had passed, right? So this family couldn't remember her last name, her maiden name. And they gave me a name of Richardson. Well, it was Richmond. And they thought it was Richardson. So I was down this rabbit hole on Richardson's. And I wasted days. And I know, I don't think they did it on purpose at all because I think they were like, well, this, we don't know much about her. And, but we'll give you this information, we'll tell you what you're asking for and you go do the research. But, something as simple as a correct name. So, that's why it's so important for information, to do the work of confirming and finding things because it turned out it was the wrong last night. It was close. They had the rich part in there, but they said Richardson. It was Richmond. And unfortunately, that's why I didn't find her in before the state police did because I was, well, find her father or know that that was the name to look for because and then I was calling all these places looking for him and trying to get guardianship information and looking under Richardson and it wasn't Richardson. So that was a really difficult thing too. So all investigations have these quirky or nuances or things that happen sometimes that can take you off course completely. And you lose time and you spend time and resources and effort and it brings nothing. And that's one of those that brought absolutely nothing. And then when I figured finally knew, I was like, it was Richmond, not Richardson, But I can't fault them. They thought they were helping me and gave me a name, and it was close, but it was not correct. So, those are some of the probably the three things that really, I would say, were the most difficult part of doing the story. It was kind of both. In some respects, I was super proud. I was super proud of myself as a journalist and super excited that I could have contributed to something that meant so much to communities, to a family, to Shirley, to everyone. So I did feel a sense of satisfaction there because for the first time, it was during the press conference of the arrest of this suspect that the prosecutor himself said, our break, because somebody else from a different station actually asked the question. It was Derek Thomas from Channel 6. And he asked, he's like, well, how did all this come together? You just don't wake up one day and you have this new suspect. How did you find him? What happened? How did this come together? And the prosecutor's response was, well, there was a news story back in November about this case, and that led to the new information and new suspects coming forward. That was me. Now, he didn't say my name. He didn't say anything like that. He wasn't going to do that. But I knew it was me. Everybody knew it was me because I was the only one doing the story last November. Nobody else was doing the story in November. And so in that realm, I was able to go and report, and you'll see in the documentary it talks about that, where I'm able to say, she told me this, and this is what we did, and here's our story, and we had the whole story, there, whereas everybody else was scrambling and just using, a little bit of file footage. So we were way ahead of everyone. So in that regard, I did get credit and I was able to know. And then even after the press conference, the prosecutor pulled me aside and he said, now you know why I couldn't talk to you. And so that's as far as he went. But, you know, again, it was my work. And so I know that. And so I felt very proud of that. It was frustrating though that, state police had a very different feeling about it. And I get it. I understand because they're investigators too. And they didn't want to have an investigation that somebody else came in and brought the answers to, right? In a way, and then the whole thing about saying that this number one suspect that they thought was a suspect was dead, that was embarrassing, okay? But that was the facts. And it wasn't like I was purposefully trying to embarrass them. But once I started going down that road and we find this guy alive in Florida, it's like, and then when I started asking, I asked all those older investigators, where'd you get this from? Who told you that? Because I'm trying to find where did it start? And nobody seemed to knew, and they were all doing this, pointing at each other. Oh, he told me. No, he told me, that kind of thing. And so it was a source of embarrassment for them. And I will go a step further for Indiana State Police. It was difficult, even more difficult for them because they had a number of cases around that time, before and after, that just really did not go well for state police. So they were having a difficult time with their investigations. There was the Jill Bierman case from IU. That was a hard case for them. They had another case where it might have been a Jill. I'm trying to think if it was Jill Bierman or another case, but they had basically dragged the Salt Creek River and I mean like siphoned out all the water, looking for some clues for another case, and it turned out to be the wrong thing. So they were already feeling some lick, they were having some difficult times. So I think what happens is when journalists are involved in these cases and I wasn't involved in those other ones, but when journalists are involved in these cases, they feel a certain they want to protect their investigations, but there's a certain fear, like, what are they going to get that we don't get? And is that going to make us look bad? And that's what they were really concerned about. And so I understand that, but at the same time, in my thought, I'm thinking, you've had 30 years to figure this out. I came in at the 33-year mark, okay? 32 years, You've had 32 years to figure this out, and no one did, and no one corrected the record, and no one did, you know what I'm saying? So it's like, I don't feel like I did anything purposefully to embarrass anyone, but that was just the facts. So it was hard though, because where you want to be able to call your police department and say, hey, I need information on this. Here's what I found. Will you sit down and talk to me? I would have loved to have spoken with any of the new investigators on camera. I asked for interviews. Sometimes they didn't even call me back. Most of the time, they didn't call me back. But they never did. And so I think it would have been more helpful with the narrative if we had been able to get them to sit down and talk about it. But most of the time, they just said no. And even when I was working on some other things, I went back trying to get other documents. And again, they were like, no, no, it's still open. And I'm like, it's open after 50 years, really? And the suspect has died, and you're still not going to give me information. And so I tend to think that that's just, no, we're not going to help you ever, and that's unfortunate. Um, but it didn't stop me, and I couldn't let that stop me. So I had to go to the FBI, find documents in other places, and it just means more work for me, but it did not stop me, and I was determined not to do that. And so it was hard, having to work with, trying to do work that's important like that, and then having an agency totally kind of stonewall you. But again, the information is out there, and so they couldn't stop the book. They end up in the book. They couldn't stop the documentary. And so I think it's a lesson for them to say, um, you know, you can work with journalists and give your side and present, your narrative. It's important that you do, but you don't have to. And if you decide not to, those spaces are going to be filled in by other, organizations, other law enforcement, agencies and things like that. And so I hope that, if anything, I hope that going forward, that some of these organizations will find the value in speaking with journalists and providing, adequate information to make sure that the record is complete, because that's what we want, right? We
Yeah.
want a complete record, and that's what we were trying to do. And so we want that. But when they refuse to talk, we can't make them. They have to turn over certain records, but we can't make them do anything. And so that's their choice. And so that's kind of where I had to land at, is that it's their choice. And even today, if one of them, unfortunately, one of the investigators passed away a couple years ago, but one is still living. And so if he would ever just say, Sandra, I want to sit down and I want to clear the record, or I want to tell you I would love to do that. And that's really what spawned the documentary. So the book itself actually did ch bring about some changes, at least like for the city of Rushville. That's how their mayor and many of their residents found out about what happened to Carol. They had heard the stories too, and some of them knew Carol. They went to school with her, all that, but they never really knew the full story. And so when we published the book in 2012, many Rushville residents, they had me come there. It was so much fun. I was part of their Rush Fest, and I sat outside the pharmacy there and sold books all day. And people stopped by and asked questions, and they were just so welcoming. They just loved the fact that I could answer some of the questions they'd had for so long. And so their mayor actually read the book, and that's what kind of ignited him. And then, so he read the book and he learned more about Carol. And then in 2017, there was the Charlottesville protest and violence, and unfortunately, the death of the young woman who was protesting there. And that really, I think, really, with the book, kind of prompted the Rushville mayor to decide that their town needed to do more to talk about race, to talk about just trying to understand and having dialogue and all these things. And so from there, they came up with this idea of having this dedication in the park. And so they reached out to Martinsville's mayor. And at that time, that mayor was Shannon Cole, and she was open to it. And she was like, yes, we need to do something. This is a great time in our country's history and a great time for Martinsville to do something different. At the same time, there was a man by the name of Don Neal, who his wife and he were the ones that welcomed Carol into their home and tried to get help for her that night. Well, Don Neal had always felt like Martinsville should have a memorial for Carol. And he had gone to the county commissioners. They voted him down. They're like, nope, we're not having that. And he wanted something that would be on the lawn of the courthouse. And they were like, no, that's only for veterans. And so he never could get any traction. And so what happened was, as this new mayor was talking about it and knowing that Don Neal wanted something too, they all came together and they came up with this idea of putting a marker outside of the city hall there. And so that was really super positive. It was just, it wasn't necessarily what Don Neal wanted. He wanted a big, a place to, like, a historical marker, but he was willing to say, okay, this is a start. This is great. And they had this amazing ceremony there. And I tell you, if you haven't seen the documentary, again, it's going to be on PBS this fall. Please watch it, because we were there. I actually spoke at both of these events. The first one was in Rushville, and the next day we were in Martinsville. Martinsville's mayor, Mayor Shannon Cole, invited me to speak, and I did. And the whole city hall was packed. It was at capacity. Even up in the balcony, there were residents of Martinsville. And of course, but it wasn't the entire city, but it was a group within that city that said, we are ready to do this work. We want people to know a different part of Martinsville. We want Martinsville to be known as a city um, that wants to reach out and welcome people. And it was a beautiful ceremony. It was incredible. In fact, there was a minister that they had there that prayed about all of these issues, and asked for forgiveness and the mayor and speaking to the family. It was just very, very emotional. And there was no dry eye in the place. It was that emotional. It was really, really incredible. And afterward, there were members of the Martinsville community that reached out to Carol's family right there, hugged them. All of this, it was like a moment of healing in some ways for the people that were there. And I remember driving home after that and just feeling this rush of emotion, like, what did I just experience? This was amazing. And I'm hoping that this is the point where things really turn and that this city will continue to grow from this event and really show the world that minds can be changed, that not everyone thinks the same, and that there are people that are generally interested in connection, no matter where people are from. And that to me was a beautiful thought and a hope. And so, it went from there. And then unfortunately, that mayor ran for reelection and was defeated. And then it just was like everything kind of hit skids, nothing else. There were no other events, no other anything. And so by the time I went back to talk with the new mayor for the documentary, they didn't even really know about the event. They didn't attend. So it was kind of sad to me because, and that, there had been this momentum and then all of a sudden it just came to a screeching halt. And so unfortunately, what people had to realize is that you're not going to change years and years and years of a perception with one event or whatever or one arrest. That was the problem back in 2002. They thought, oh, we're vindicated, our city's vindicated. There's been an arrest and he's from Indianapolis, but he had friends in Martinsville and he felt fine doing what he was doing in Martinsville, but they just kind of dismissed all that. So I think the biggest thing that I learned from all of that, and I hope that the town of Martinsville has learned, is that it takes ongoing conversation. It's like a relationship. You can't just say, do years and years of things and ignore things and then just say, okay, one day I said I'm sorry and everything's great now. No, you've got to keep working at it and you've got to build that. You've got to build trust. You've got to invite people in. And I was hoping that Martinsville would want to show the documentary or even see it. So my hope is that as more people see the documentary, I think they're afraid of the documentary. And I don't think the documentary is as bad as maybe they perceive it to be. Like it wasn't just going after Martinsville. We presented all of the information, factual things that actually happened. And we had their mayor on. He sat down and did the interview after a year of waiting. He finally agreed to do it, but then he also, excuse me.
I know I have a
I
cold.
know.
It's
And so then afterwards, I think he was just kind of like, um, not very friendly about it. And so I don't know if they were just afraid of it or not, but I hope that now that it is on PBS. It was on PBS back in February um, at WTIU in Bloomington. So I hope that many of those residents have had a chance to watch it and that they can see it in a different way, the way, from a very inclusive perspective that we included so many people and we talked to as many people as we could. And so I hope that they look at it from that and are able to step back and say, okay, I think I kind of get this. And it's not just bash Martinsville, bash Martinsville. It's like Martinsville, we're trying to help everyone to deal with this issue because we know that your town has suffered as well because of it. And the reason it suffered is because it was never dealt with. It was always like, just push it away, like it'll go away, just make it go away. And unfortunately, problems don't just go away because we wish them away. A lot of times we've got to take active and intentional steps um, to make things better.